Thomas Sowell explained visually. Today we'll talk about minimum wage, and it's based mainly on the book Discrimination and Disparities. Thomas Sowell says the consequences of minimum wage comes down to two things, and these are both common sense. Number one, an increase in job applicants due to a higher wage. It's common sense. If you raise wages, more people want that job. It's more than likely that more people will apply for that job. Number two, again, it's common sense, but I imagine someone is going to want to disagree. We'll get to that in a moment. But here it is. There will be a decrease in the number of workers hired due to labor being made more expensive. Imagine that. Labor's more expensive. You can afford less of it. If tennis shoes cost more, guess what? You can buy less tennis shoes. So if workers are more expensive, you can afford less workers. It's common sense. But anyway, let's focus on number one. There will be an increase in job applicants due to a higher wage. Before minimum wage, imagine a world where wages are low. Less people apply because I don't want to work for that. It's not enough money. I won't apply. Well, let's reverse it, flip it on its head. Let's create a minimum wage, which raises the minimum amount you can pay someone. More people will apply because they'll say, hey, I'll take that job. I'll do it. That's not a bad price. I will work. So minimum wage goes up. Job applicants go up. We all agree. You don't disagree with that one. That's not a controversial statement. Number two, which I'm sure you're going to want to fight over. Maybe not. Maybe you're on my side. Decrease in number of workers hired due to, it's not my side anyway, it's Thomas Sowell. Hired due to labor being made more expensive. So things get more expensive, you buy less of it. Minimum wage goes up, workers hired goes down. In this scenario, the boss can afford to pay $15 an hour in wages. That means every hour he has $15 allotted. He can afford to pay out $15 towards labor costs. So in example A, there's no minimum wage here in example A, and there are two people. Guess what? He figures that if I got $15, I can pay both of you $7.50 an hour. I've got two employees. It seems to work out fine. Great. Oh, well, no one's really making a lot of money, but I am able to employ two people. In example B, that's great. $15 minimum wage. Government rights law says, nope, you got to pay everybody at least $15. Well, all I've got is $15, says the boss. So the boss has to make a hard decision. If he only has $15, for every hour, then he can only afford to pay for one employee because it's $15 minimum wage. He hires one guy, too bad, so sad, and that guy's out. So there it is. We raised the minimum wage and less workers were hired. Oh, you just picked an arbitrary number to prove your point. Yeah, well, you're right. The math does work out pretty good for me in that scenario. But you know what? I'll humor you a little bit here, Red, because Thomas Sowell says as the minimum wage goes up, workers hiring goes down. Less people will be hired. We will decrease the number of workers as we increase the minimum wage. So let's let this play out. $15 an hour. I did my scenario where $15 an hour was allotted as a minimum wage, and he could only afford one worker. And I showed how we went from two workers to one worker. You know what would be nice? If the government stepped in, because $15 is not enough for some people, for most people. You need more than $15 to have a reasonably decent way of life. So why not give everybody $50 an hour? The government steps in, passes a law, raise the minimum wage, fight for $50. Well, that's ludicrous. Well, to some people it sounds ludicrous. To others it doesn't sound ludicrous. But you know what's going to happen? You and I know what's going to happen because we know what it says at the top of the screen in the yellow. What's going to happen if we make the pizza place pay everybody $50 an hour? If we make the coffee shop, the boss of the coffee shop has to pay every single one of his employees $50 an hour. If the restaurant has to pay every one of the workers $50 an hour. If the mechanic down the street running the shop has to pay every single one of his mechanics at least $50 an hour, will hiring go up or will it go down? Is he going to be able to hire more workers? Or will he be forced to hire less workers? Hey, you know what? Let's increase the minimum wage to $100. What do you think is going to happen? Will we be able to hire more or less? Will the amount of hiring decrease? Of course it will. We will hire less. So there it is. Oh, well, that's an exaggeration. It doesn't matter if it's an exaggeration. What we're showing is the point that when minimum wage goes up, clearly hiring is going to go down. That's all that matters in this situation. It also just requires a little bit of common sense, Red. A little bit. Discrimination number 2. We'll talk about discrimination 1 and discrimination 2 in another video. It's kind of the root of the book, Discrimination and Disparities. Discrimination 2 is what you typically think of when you think of discrimination. When you hear the word discrimination, you think of treating people negatively based on sex or race. You don't think of the textbook, normal, original version of discrimination. That's fine. We'll do that in another video. But in this video right here, we're talking about racism. And in this case, the boss is a green guy of the green race, and he is a racist. He prefers green people. He does not like anyone who is outside of his green race. That is discrimination 2. In this scenario, we're talking about minimum wage, and we're also talking about how discrimination 2, or your typical discrimination, comes into play. Now, For this first scenario, we are talking about no minimum wage. No minimum wage, racist boss. Discrimination number 2. Again, no minimum wage here, and a racist boss. The racist boss does not have to pay anyone a minimum wage. He has 2 people that come in for jobs. He has an unqualified green person. Hey, that's his guys, green people, but he's unqualified, unskilled, no experience. And then there is a blue person, which he doesn't like because, again, he's a racist and he discriminates against blue people. But the blue person is qualified, has skill, has experience, and is better for his job. He has to make a choice in a scenario where we have no minimum wage. When there is no minimum wage, the green racist boss has to make a choice. He can hire the green guy that is of his race, but his business will suffer if he hires him. He's going to pay the cost for being racist because his business is going to employ someone who is not skilled, who is inexperienced. His business will likely lose money. His business may go out of business. So if he chooses to be racist, he will be punished by the market. This happens when there is no minimum wage. The alternative is that he abandons his racism and hires the skilled worker. And we slowly deteriorate racism. We overcome these racist ideas. He steps closer and hires and works with someone who is of the race that he does not like. That scenario only unfolds in a situation where we have no minimum wage. When there's no minimum wage, 2 things happen. Either he hires someone out of his racist beliefs and his business suffers, so he's punished, or B, he abandons his racism and hires someone of the race that he fears, but his business does well because that person is qualified. That only happens when you have no minimum wage. What happens when we have a minimum wage? Let's throw a minimum wage. Remember, when we have a minimum wage, we increase the amount of job applicants. You didn't argue with that. That was point number 1 by Thomas Sowell. We all agreed with that. So again, boom, minimum wage is in play. Minimum wage is in play. We have a minimum wage. We have an increase in applicants. So guess what happens for the racist boss? You're doing him a favor because when we increase the amount of applicants, it's very likely that not only will he find a green person like his racist heart desires, but he's also going to find a green person that's qualified and has experience. In the scenario before, where we didn't get a lot of applicants, it was very unlikely that he was going to be able to fulfill his racist desires and get what his business needs. When you increase the minimum wage, you increase the amount of job applicants, and so it's very likely that he finds a green person like him who is also qualified and experienced. And so when you have a minimum wage, no harm, no penalty to his business whatsoever, and he is allowed to continue to be a racist. When there was no minimum wage, he either hurt financially or he had to make a change racially. When there is a minimum wage, no penalty, you can keep on being racist, boss. So on review, no minimum wage, not very many applicants, he has to make a choice. Hire the person of his race that's not qualified and allow his business to suffer, or maybe get beyond racism. He has to make that choice in that scenario because racism will hurt his business. He's going to hire someone who's unqualified, who will likely hurt the amount of money he makes. Now, when you have a minimum wage, he gets more applicants, and he's able to find someone who meets the qualifications of the job, but also meets the qualifications of his racism. That happens in a minimum wage. So basically, a minimum wage harms minority groups. Now, let's get beyond race. Let's not talk about race. That tends to rile people up. Let's look at it from a different avenue. So we know that when we create minimum wage, we increase the amount of job applicants. You can look at, you can get different applicants from a bunch of different races, but that's not the only scenario. We're not only getting a bunch of applicants from different races, but you get different applicants from different age groups. We have minimum wage, you increase the amount of job applicants. So you get more teenagers apply, but you also get more adults that apply competing for the same job. Who's going to get that job? Well, of course, it's going to be the adult. They have more experience. They have lifelong skills. They're going to get the job. Maybe they're more dependable. Maybe they have a family to support. Either way, it's not a fair matchup. And you create this unfair matchup by creating a minimum wage, which draws in more applicants, which is more likely to pull in more adults to the field, into the pool, and it ends up in less teens getting jobs. So just as we showed that minorities are going to suffer when you create a minimum wage, also teens are going to suffer when you create a minimum wage. When there's no minimum wage, the adults don't apply. It's not enough money. They can't support themselves. They can't support their family. They won't apply. It means more jobs for teens. And it's not just that job. It's not just that one job at McDonald's. Sure, that's job number 1. But job number 1 leads to job number 2 with more experience and more skill and more wages. And when you get that under your belt and on your resume, that leads to job 3 and job 4 and job 5. And slowly but surely, the teen accrues skills and experience that lead to more opportunities down the road. But it all starts with job number 1, and job number 1 never happens because of minimum wage. Before you get job number 2, you need the experience from job number 1, but the teens are being excluded from the market because of minimum wages forcing them to compete with adults that have more skills and more experience because of minimum wage. Not only does it affect job 1, but it affects their future employment and wages. So let's look at 1948. Unemployment rates for blacks and white teens, 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds, were the same. It was the same. See, so that's pretty crazy to imagine. Often we think about, oh, it's so racist then. Sure, it was. This was Jim Crow America. So yes, it was racist, but 16-year-old blacks and whites made the same amount of wages, or the same amount of employment rate. Same thing for 18-year-olds. And so that was the same for jobs 1, jobs as 18-year-olds, and also jobs as 20 to 24-year-olds. If something interesting happens, well, not really. Now, if you look at the mid-1950s, in the 1950s, there were minimum wage laws on the books, as Thomas Sowell describes in the book that we are discussing, which is Discrimination and Disparities. But not until the mid-1950s did the inflation rate catch up to the minimum wage and make it actually come into play. And so in the mid-1950s, the minimum wage actually becomes a real force. And the minimum wage, whenever it goes up, less workers are hired, and we see that less blacks get hired as 16-year-olds. And then we look in the mid-1960s. So we fast forward a little bit over a decade, and we look at 18-year-olds, and we find out that white 18-year-olds, the employment rate's basically the same, but blacks are being hired less. So we see the 18-year-olds in the mid-1960s, we see a dip or a decrease in hiring because of the minimum wage. And then 1970, we look at the age group of 20 to 24-year-olds, and again, we see this pattern continue where whites are still being hired at the same rate, but black unemployment rate is increasing. Why is that? Well, it all traces back to the root. If you're not hired for the initial job, when you're 18, it's harder to get a job. And then when you're 20 to 24, it makes it even harder to get a job because we've created a barrier, an entry barrier. We're excluding people at the very beginning because of an increase in minimum wage. Again, minimum wage goes up. We all agree now. Less workers are hired. And if you hire less 16-year-olds, it makes that 16-year hard because they don't have the experience anymore. They don't have job number 1. It makes it tougher to get the job at 18. It makes it tougher to get the job at 20, 24-year-old. Now, I know someone's just going to say, no. The reason that we're getting hired is racism. No, that's not it. Because if it were really racism, then we would have seen it all decrease. We should have seen 1950s for 16-year-olds, 1950s 18-year-olds, and 1950s for 20 and 24-year-olds. We should have seen decreases, or an increase in unemployment or a decrease in the amount of being hired across the board. If it was racism, a 16-year-old black is child or male or boy or woman is no different than an 18-year-old black boy or a girl. They don't become more or less black. So if it were racism, it should have been across the board. It shouldn't be this pattern. But because there's a pattern where we see in the mid-1950s, there is a decrease. And then a little bit later, we see it among an older group. And we see it a little bit later. It shows that what happened was the minimum wage increase led to less workers being hired at the beginning, and then showed the compounding effect of excluding blacks from the marketplace and taking away that opportunity, which took away the opportunity to develop skills, which then made it impossible for them to earn jobs at an older age. That's why we see the wave. Minimum wage goes up, black unemployment goes up, and it starts at the root. I don't care, it's still racist. Okay, Red. Well, let's look at this. 1948. This is the height of Jim Crow. Very racist time. Unemployment rate for black teenagers was 10%. And that was similar to white teens. They were at a very similar rate of unemployment. We look at 2019, 55 years after the Civil Rights Act, and no one in their right mind would argue that racism is worse today. Not possible. Unemployment rate for black teens is 20% and 2 times larger than white teens. If it were racism, then this number would be higher when America was more racist. But it's not. The number is higher when America is less racist. So maybe the unemployment rate has to do with the minimum wage going up means the black unemployment. It's not just black, it's every race. When you raise the minimum wage, less workers are hired. So good luck with your fight for 15, because we know that basically the minimum wage is racist. But I hear you, Red. I'm going to give you your opportunity to speak. Yes, you found a study based on employer surveys that proves all of this wrong. All right, well, most studies are going to show you that when you increase the minimum wage, you're going to increase unemployment. Most studies. Now, you've got this one study with this one survey that says, no. When you increase wages, everything is good. All right, well, let's just play this out. So we've got these stores in town, and we pass a law that increases minimum wage. And the social scientist creates all these surveys and sends out the surveys trying to find out what's going on with the employers, how is it affecting your business, blah, 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 blah. They get all the data, they send it back. The guy looks at it and says, you know what, you're right, minimum wage does not increase unemployment. Thomas Sowell, you're wrong. Okay. Let's look at this a little closer then. So here's what actually happens. Minimum wage goes up. The social scientist gets the surveys, sends them out. There you go. You guys finished this. Well, because we raised the minimum wage, one of the effects, but because of raising the minimum wage, it made this business hard to stay in business because they had to pay their employees too much and they went out of business. And yeah, same thing here. We could no longer afford to pay our employees, so we had to shut down. And so they're out of business, and with them went their survey. And we only get surveys back from the people that didn't go out of business. You're only getting the positive data. You don't get the bad stuff because they're not in business anymore. They're not sending it back. They're not there anymore. I mean, if you could get that data back, then you would probably get different results. And so in true Thomas Sowell fashion, he gives us this analogy often in many of his books. So using such research methods, you could survey people who have played Russian roulette and prove from their experiences that it's a harmless activity, since those for whom it was not a harmless activity are unlikely to be around to be surveyed.